Imagine waking up to a letter from your local HOA telling you you're being fined heavily. You haven't thrown loud parties. You haven't built anything weird in your yard. You haven't even parked your truck on the grass. Know your crime? Hunting in the woods where you've always gone. Quietly, legally, respectfully. Now, let me ask you something. Have you ever been so stunned by something that for a few seconds you thought it was a prank? That was me, standing in my kitchen, holding a bright white envelope with bold black letters that read, "Violation notice, $3,750 fine." At first, I thought they had the wrong person. I read it twice, 3 times. It clearly said it was for hunting within a community safety zone. But the thing is, the place they were talking about wasn't even part of the neighborhood. It was the woods behind my house, a huge stretch of trees that's been there since long before the HOA was even formed. I grew up here. Those woods, that's where my dad taught me how to hunt, where I took my first deer, where I go to clear my head after a long week. It's not just some trees and trails. It's personal. It's history. So getting fined for doing something I'd done for years, something that's never hurt anyone, something I do far away from homes or people, that hit a nerve. But here's the part that got me boiling. The HOA claimed they were fining me for endangering the safety of residents using the trails. What trails? I hadn't seen a single official sign post or notice saying the area was part of the community trail system. No markers, no fences, no warnings, just woods. So I did what anyone would do. I called the HOA office. I wanted to get to the bottom of it, maybe straighten out a misunderstanding. But what I got instead was a cold, smug voice telling me the decision was final. And if I wanted to appeal, I'd need to attend a board meeting next month. Next month? So I'm fine now, but I get to speak later? That's how it works. I decided not to wait. I drove down to the county clerk's office to pull property maps. If they were going to claim I was breaking the rules, I wanted to see exactly whose rules I was supposedly breaking. And that's when things started to get interesting. The land wasn't owned by the HOA. It wasn't even part of the community property. It was owned by a timber company based out of state. A private piece of land that the HOA had no claim to, no rights over. Yet they had the nerve to fine me as if they ran the place. So I started asking around, talked to some neighbors. Turns out the HOA had been quietly building walking trails into those woods for a few years. Little by little, no one asked who owned the land. They just assumed it belonged to the neighborhood. People walked their dogs there. Kids rode bikes. Some families even held cookouts under the trees, right next to where I had hunting blinds. It was a disaster waiting to happen, but no one seemed to care until they saw me, in full camo, walking out of the woods with a bow. Suddenly, I was a villain. I wasn't mad at the people. I was mad at the arrogance, at the idea that someone sitting behind a desk thought they had the power to fine me for being on land they didn't even own. That's when something inside me shifted. I realized this wasn't just about a fine. It wasn't about rules or safety. It was about control. They wanted to set the rules for everything, even things they had no business touching. I wasn't about to let that happen. Not to me. Not to the land my family had walked for decades. And definitely not to the next person who thought they could enjoy the outdoors without permission from a board full of people who didn't know the first thing about it. What I did next wasn't just unexpected. It changed everything. My name's Mike Townsend, and I've lived in this neighborhood for almost 12 years. I'm not the loud guy on the corner, not the type who shows up at every meeting with a list of complaints. I keep to myself. I mow my lawn. I wave to neighbors. I follow the rules, within reason. But I've always believed there's a line between community guidelines and personal freedom, and lately, that line's been getting blurry. The forest behind my house. Those woods were more than just trees and trails. They were where I found peace. They stretched for hundreds of acres, mostly untouched, wild and quiet. On cool fall mornings, I'd head out with my bow before the sun came up. I wasn't bothering anyone. I was within shouting distance of the nearest house. It was just me, the birds, and the crunch of leaves under my boots. And then the fine showed up, that ridiculous fine. Suddenly, I was labeled a danger to the neighborhood, a risk, a threat, and all because I did what I've always done, on land no one else even looked at twice. Still, I didn't go off the rails. I wanted answers. Real answers. I wanted someone, anyone, from the HOA to explain how they had the authority to fine me for hunting on private property that didn't belong to them. But that's the thing with some HOA boards. Once they feel powerful, they start acting like they own everything, like the neighborhood is their little kingdom, and everyone else lives there by their grace. I sat down at my desk that night and opened up every document I could find. Deeds, maps, zoning laws, anything related to that forest. I needed to be sure. And what I discovered was more than just confusing. It was revealing. That land wasn't tied to the HOA at all. It was owned by a company called East Valley Timber. I found their name buried in a parcel database. I even pulled up their articles of incorporation. They were based across the country. They hadn't touched that land in years. They weren't harvesting lumber. They weren't doing anything with it. And best of all, they were selling. At first, I laughed at myself. The idea of buying a forest sounded like something out of a movie. Who buys a forest? That's not a normal Tuesday afternoon thought. But the more I sat with it, the more it started to make sense. I wasn't just some angry neighbor anymore. I was someone with a real reason to act. If I bought that land, there would be no confusion, no threats, no more shady trail building projects, no more surprise finds. So I called East Valley Timber the next morning. A woman named Denise picked up. Friendly voice. I told her I was interested in purchasing the 400-acre parcel off the back of Oak Ridge Lane. She paused. I could tell she was surprised. Not many buyers come calling for forests in small-town neighborhoods. She told me it was still available, but that a few developers had sniffed around over the years. I asked for a price. She said she'd check with the board and get back to me. That week felt like it dragged on forever. Every time I checked my email, my heart jumped a little. And then finally, there it was. They were open to an offer. They wanted it gone. The taxes, the liability, the upkeep, they were done with it. I made them a fair offer, just over market value. Enough to make them happy. Not so much that I feel like I got played. A few emails, some legal back and forth, and suddenly, it was mine. I held the paperwork in my hands, sitting at the same desk where I'd read that fine just weeks earlier. I own the forest now. Every tree, every trail, every inch of that land was legally under my name. But this wasn't just a personal win. This was about the principle of it all. About showing that just because someone's on a board doesn't mean they get to walk all over people. About drawing a line in the dirt and then owning the dirt under that line. And I wasn't done yet, because now that I had the land, I had decisions to make. And trust me, those decisions were going to send shockwaves through the entire neighborhood. The day after the sale closed, I walked through the woods with a different feeling in my chest. This time, I wasn't just a guy with a bow, blending into the brush. I was the owner. The air felt heavier. The trees seemed taller. I wasn't looking over my shoulder anymore, waiting for someone to question what I was doing. I had the deed in my pocket and a whole new mindset. I didn't rush into anything right away. I wanted to move carefully, smart, strategic. I knew that what I was about to do wouldn't sit well with everyone. But this wasn't about pleasing anyone. It was about making things right. For years, the HOA had treated that land like their playground. They carved out trails, built wooden bridges, even put up signs with cute little names like Maple Path and Deer Run. Not once did they ask permission, not from the original owners, not from the county, and definitely not from me. They just assumed the land was theirs to use. That kind of arrogance doesn't go away on its own. So I started with the basics. I hired a local surveyor to mark the boundaries. Big, bright-colored stakes went up around the entire perimeter of the property. Then I put up signs. Not small ones either. Big, bold, impossible-to-miss signs. Asterisk private property. No trespassing. Entry by written permission only. Asterisk. I didn't have to ban anyone yet, but I wanted the message to be crystal clear. This was no longer some undefined, unclaimed piece of land. It was mine. And if people wanted to use it, they'd need to go through me first. I knew word would get out fast. And I wasn't wrong. Within 48 hours, my phone started buzzing. Unknown numbers, block calls, HOA board members. One of them even had the nerve to stop by my house and politely ask if I'd be willing to discuss the future use of community trails. I invited him in, sat him down, and showed him the property maps, the title, and the bill of sale. Then I slid over a copy of the fine they gave me and asked him what gave them the right to enforce anything on land they never owned. He didn't have an answer, just a red face and a weak apology. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I just let the facts do the talking. That weekend, the HOA held an emergency meeting. It wasn't public, but I knew people who were in that room. The board was furious. They wanted to challenge the sale, claim easement rights, whatever they could dig up. But the truth was, they had no leg to stand on. They'd built on private land without permission. No permits. No agreements. Nothing. If they pushed me, they'd be the ones in legal trouble. So I made my move. I sent out a formal notice to the HOA. All community trails crossing my property were to be closed immediately. Access was revoked. Anyone found on the land without written permission would be reported for trespassing. I even gave them 7 days to comply before I started enforcing it. You'd think I declared war. Emails started flying. A few neighbors cornered me while I was checking my mail, telling me how unfair it was, how their kids loved playing those woods, how I was being selfish. I listened. I really did. I let them talk. But then I'd ask one simple question. Did you know the HOA never owned that land? Most of them didn't. They just assumed, like everyone else, that if there were trails and signs, it was part of the community. Assumptions don't hold up in court. By midweek, I had contractors removing footbridges and unauthorized benches. I hired a forestry consultant to help restore damaged areas. I wasn't doing this to be petty. I was doing it to protect what should have been protected in the first place. If they wanted to treat the forest like a park, they should have bought it themselves. But they didn't. I did. And as the trail closed signs went up, I stood there in the shade of those tall pines and watched a quiet message settle over the neighborhood. Sometimes, the only way to earn respect is to own the ground they tried to take from you. After the signs went up, things didn't just simmer. They boiled. The quiet stares from my neighbors turned into hushed conversations. People slowed down when driving past my house. A few even stopped and took pictures of the new "no trespassing" signs like they couldn't believe they were real. But I didn't back down. If anything, their reactions confirmed I was doing the right thing. I wasn't trying to punish anyone. I was protecting my rights, my land, and frankly, setting the record straight. You don't get to break rules for years and then cry foul when someone finally draws a boundary, especially when the land never belonged to you in the first place. But just when I thought things were settling into place, the HOA hit back with legal threats. I got a letter delivered to my door by certified mail. Thick envelope, heavy paper. You know the type, meant to look intimidating. Inside, the HOA's attorney was demanding that I cease and desist the restriction of community trail access and restore all access points previously enjoyed by neighborhood residents. Enjoyed? That word stuck with me, as if enjoyment was a legal right. As if people's feelings about walking through land they didn't own somehow overruled the law. The letter was full of vague language and scare tactics, but nothing solid. No actual legal claim. No documentation to support their argument. Just a bunch of puffed-up phrases, and a weak attempt to scare me into backing down. I wasn't rattled. I handed the letter to my lawyer. She read through it, laughed, and said, "They don't have a case." She sent them a polite, professional response. The land was purchased legally, all easement records had been checked, and the HOA had no lawful claim. If they pursued it, we'd be more than happy to meet them in court. That was the last I heard from their lawyer. But that didn't stop the noise. The HOA president, Janet, started holding informal meetings at the clubhouse, talking to people, gathering support, trying to paint me as the bad guy. "He's destroying community spirit," she reportedly said. "He's blocking nature access from our children." I heard all of it. People love a dramatic headline, especially when they're not getting the full story. What she didn't mention was how the HOA illegally extended trails beyond their borders, or how they fined a resident for an activity on land they didn't control, or how they never once tried to work with the land's actual owner before laying down bridges and paths. That's when I decided to take things one step further. I filed a complaint with the county zoning office. I submitted photos of the unauthorized structures the HOA built, footbridges, benches, trail signs, all installed without permits. Some even crossed drainage paths and disturbed wildlife areas. The county sent out an inspector. He walked the entire trail system, what was left of it, and started taking notes. Within a week, the HOA received their own letter. This one was from the county, and it wasn't asking nicely. Violations, fines, demand for removal. Suddenly, the pressure shifted. Now the HOA wasn't just dealing with me. They were facing actual consequences from the authorities. And the best part? I didn't have to lift a finger. All I did was expose what they'd been doing in the dark. And just like that, the tone changed. A few board members resigned quietly. Janet stopped showing up at community events. Whispers started to spread that the HOA might elect a new president, someone less confrontational, someone who wouldn't try to turn neighbors into enemies over land that never belonged to them. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. That's not what this was about. It wasn't revenge. It was about accountability, about showing that the people who make the rules also have to follow them. But the tension was still thick. Neighbors avoided eye contact. Some still blamed me. Others quietly thanked me. I started getting notes in my mailbox. One just said, "Thank you for standing up to them." Another said, "We needed this wake-up call." And all I could think was, maybe now they'll understand why I did what I did. One morning, just after sunrise, I was walking the edge of my property when I noticed something odd. A couple of kids were riding bikes through the woods. They weren't causing trouble, just cruising along what used to be one of the old trails. I didn't yell. I didn't wave a sign. I just watched them ride off, back toward the neighborhood. That moment stuck with me. It reminded me of something I had forgotten during all this chaos. This wasn't just about rules and property lines. This was about people who had been led to believe something false for years, and now had to adjust to a new truth. It made me realize I had a choice to make. I could keep things locked down tight, treat the forest like a fortress, and make an example out of every single trespasser. Or I could do something bigger, something smarter, something that still kept control in my hands, but gave the community a path forward. So I started planning. I called my lawyer again, but this time not for defense. I wanted to set up a land use agreement, something official, something that let me say, yes, I own this land, but here's how you can use it on my terms. I didn't owe them that, but I figured if I could do it the right way, I could rebuild a little trust and still keep the power where it belonged. I also called in a local conservation group. We walked the land together, and they helped me identify sensitive areas that should never be touched, natural springs, animal habitats, places where damage had already been done by those unauthorized trails. We mapped out what could be open and what should be protected. Then I drafted a set of rules. Clear, simple, no hunting outside of approved zones, no fires, no building structures. All visitors must sign in online. The land stays clean, safe, and quiet. Any violation? Banned for life. And this time, the rules wouldn't be enforced by some HOA volunteer with a clipboard. They'd be enforced by me with the backing of law. The pushback came fast. Some people loved the idea. Some hated it. The HOA didn't say much publicly, but I could tell from their silence they weren't happy. They weren't in control anymore, and that probably bothered them more than anything else. I put up a new sign at the trail entrance. This one didn't say, "No trespassing." It said, "Private forest access by permit only. Apply online." Underneath that, a small plaque, "Owned and managed by towns and stewardship land." It was quiet for a few days. Then the emails started coming in. Families asking for permission to walk. People offering to volunteer for cleanup days. A local scout troop asking if they could earn service hours helping with trail maintenance. Something was shifting. The narrative was changing. Even a few board members from the HOA reached out quietly, privately. One of them even admitted that the original fine they gave me was probably overreaching and that the board had acted too quickly. No formal apology, but it was something. And then came the letter. Not from the HOA this time, but from the same county office that had fined them earlier. It was an offer. They wanted to list my forest as part of the county's Protected Green Space Initiative. No ownership changes, just recognition. It would give me access to state-level resources for conservation, and in return, I'd agree to keep the land undeveloped for at least 20 years. I didn't say yes right away. I wanted to think about it. But deep down, I already knew my answer, because this wasn't just about property anymore. It wasn't even just about standing up for myself. It had become something much bigger, about reclaiming control in a world where too many people are told what to do, where to go, and what they can't do on their own land. And now, for the first time in a long time, I wasn't being told what I couldn't do. I was deciding what came next. A few weeks after the new sign went up, I got an email that caught me off guard. It was from a woman named Claire, someone I know personally, but who lived 3 streets over. She said her father used to take her on walks through those woods when she was a little girl. Said she hadn't been back there in years, but the news about the forest had stirred something up in her. She wasn't asking for anything. No demands, no complaints. Just a thank you. She said it meant something to her, that someone was finally taking care of that land the way it deserved. That message stuck with me, because for months, all I'd heard were angry voices. People upset they'd lost something they thought belonged to them. But now, little by little, the noise was changing. Not everyone saw me as the villain anymore. Some were starting to understand what I was really doing. Still, there were people who hadn't moved on. I caught a man sneaking onto the land one Saturday afternoon. Older guy. He looked surprised when I stepped out from the trees and confronted him. I wasn't aggressive. I just asked what he was doing. He said he didn't know the land was private now. I pointed to the sign less than 50 feet from where we stood. He shrugged. "We've always used this trail," he said. Didn't think anyone really cared. That sentence right there, that's the core of it all. Didn't think anyone really cared. For so long, people treated the land like it was a free-for-all, not because they were evil or reckless, but because no one ever told them otherwise. There were no boundaries, no rules, no accountability. And when I stepped in with ownership and clear expectations, it felt like a disruption, like I was ruining something. But what I was actually doing was giving that forest something it hadn't had in a long time: respect. After that encounter, I decided to go a step further. I created a simple website. Nothing fancy, just a home page with some photos, a bit of history, and a place to apply for walking permits. I called it the Townsend Preserve. I didn't charge anything for permits. All I asked was that people read the rules, respect the land, and check in before entering. Every visitor got a small ID tag to carry, like a library card for woods, and I limited the number of passes each week to keep things quiet. To my surprise, it worked. Better than I expected. People followed the rules. They signed in, stayed on the map trails, even picked up trash when they saw it. I started getting photos sent to me. Deer spotted at sunrise, owls nesting in old pines, a kid's first solo hike with his dad. It was like the whole place had transformed, not just physically, but in the way people saw it. And I noticed something else too. Since putting structure around the land, the wildlife had started returning. More birds, fewer broken branches. No more random fire pits or trash piles. The land was healing, slowly but surely. I walked those trails every morning, and it felt different. It was quiet, but not empty. It was alive in a new way. And every time I passed a marker or saw a respectful hiker with a tag on their backpack, I felt like this crazy journey actually meant something. There were still whispers from the HOA, of course. I'd hear things like, "He's just trying to prove a point," or "This won't last. People will get bored." But that didn't matter, because it wasn't about making a scene anymore. It wasn't even about the fight. It was about purpose. Funny thing is, when I started this whole thing, I just wanted to hunt in peace. Now, I found myself becoming the steward of something much bigger, something worth protecting, not just from others, but even from myself. Because the truth is, power changes you, not in the dramatic way people think, but in the subtle ways. It forces you to look at your choices a little closer, forces you to think bigger than your own backyard. And maybe that's the real twist in all this. That what started as a response to a fine turned into something that changed the way an entire neighborhood interacts with the land around them. I didn't just buy a forest. I took responsibility for it. And in doing that, I realized something more important than property rights or trail signs. I realized how much impact one quiet, persistent decision can have on everything that comes after. One morning, just as the fog was lifting from the forest floor, I was walking along the edge of the property when I saw something new, a wooden signpost sticking awkwardly out of the ground. It wasn't mine. Someone had taken upon themselves to reclaim one of the old trails by renaming it with a cheap plywood marker. The name? Community Pathway. There was no mistaking the message. It wasn't an act of nostalgia. It was defiance, a quiet challenge to everything I had built over the past few months. I took it down, not with anger, just with a drill and a crowbar. I removed the screws, laid the pieces in my truck, and drove them to the recycling center. No drama, no confrontations. But it was a clear reminder. Not everyone was ready to accept the change. For some, I was still just a guy who ruined their secret escape into the woods. And no matter how many signs I put up or permits I issued, they weren't going to let it go. That small rebellion didn't break me, but it did push me to double down on something I'd been thinking about for weeks. I didn't want to keep playing defense. I wanted to take control of the story. So I started documenting the forest, not just with pictures, but with facts. I kept records, wildlife sightings, trail maintenance logs, the number of permits issued, community volunteer hours. I built a small monthly report, nothing flashy, and started sending it out to a local newsletter. No spin, no opinions, just proof. Proof that this land was thriving under new care. That data did something I didn't expect. It earned respect. A few months ago, people were whispering behind fences. Now, I was getting invitations to speak at the local school, to join a conservation panel, even to attend an HOA town hall. I turned down the last one, not out of spite, but because I didn't need to justify myself to a group that had once tried to find me into submission. Instead, I focused on building something better. I installed 2 small trail cameras, not for hunting, but for observation. The footage showed foxes trotting along old paths, owls swooping low near the creek bed, even a black bear once, far in the distance. I compiled the best clips into a short video and uploaded it to the forest website. No narration, just nature doing what it does when left undisturbed. People shared it, a lot of people. Even folks who had once complained about the trail closure started to comment. Some said they hadn't realized how much damage the old community use had done. Others asked how they could help. It was slow but real. The tone was shifting. I wasn't the outsider anymore. I was the guy who took a mess and turned it into something meaningful. And then came the kid with the notebook. He couldn't have been more than 10 or 11. He showed up at the trailhead one Saturday with his dad, both wearing the forest access tags. The kid had a little spiral notebook and a pencil, and he told me he was tracking bird species for a school project. He asked me if I'd seen any woodpeckers lately. I smiled and told him to check near the North Trail, where they like to tap on the old pines. I watched him walk off with his dad, and it hit me. This was a future I had accidentally built, a place where people learned instead of trespassed, where they asked permission, followed rules, and still got to experience something wild and real, something that had been ignored and trampled for years, now carefully coming back to life. But it wasn't perfect. There were still moments of tension. A neighbor who insisted I was hoarding the land, another who accused me of turning nature into a gated community. I didn't respond to most of it. Some arguments just aren't worth the time. But every now and then, I'd have a real conversation with someone who genuinely wanted to understand. And those talks always came back to one thing: boundaries. Not just the ones drawn on a map, but the invisible lines between what we assume we're entitled to and what we actually earn. This forest became a mirror for that, a reminder that even the wildest places need a little order, a little intention, if they're going to survive the weight of people's footsteps. And I hadn't expected it, but somewhere in the middle of restoring the land, I'd started restoring something in myself too. There was a time, not long ago, when I didn't even think twice about where the trail started or who had the right to walk it. Like most people, I assumed that if something looked like public space, it probably was. That assumption cost me a fine and started a wildfire of neighborly outrage. But more than that, it pulled me into a story I never meant to write. And yet, here I was, standing at the edge of the very same woods, now fully mine, watching a group of volunteers dig out an old drainage ditch to help with runoff before the next rainstorm. These weren't the same faces that used to walk through the trees without asking. They were new. Parents, students, retirees. People who had gone through the permit process, attended a brief orientation, and then asked how they could help. Not just hike, not just use. Help. That was the difference. And it made all the conflict, all the complaints, all the resistance feel like a stepping stone instead of a weight. I didn't go looking for community. I didn't buy the land to make friends or start a movement. I bought it because I'd been pushed. Fine. Told I was in the wrong for something I wasn't even doing illegally. But once I took ownership, once the deed was in my name, I realized there was more power and responsibility than rebellion. Still, there were moments when I caught myself watching from the sidelines, wondering if people were really changing or just adjusting to new rules because they had no choice. One afternoon, a man showed up with an expired pass. He said he forgot to renew it. I explained the system, offered him a QR code to apply again, and reminded him of the rules. He looked me in the eye and said, "You really care about this, don't you?" I didn't answer right away, because the truth is, I hadn't set out to care. But somewhere along the line, I started seeing this forest the way a parent sees a child. Wild, unpredictable, full of potential, but needing boundaries to grow. You don't love something because it's easy. You love it because it matters. And the more the forest came back to life, the more I realized just how much damage had been done under the banner of community use. There were patches of land where nothing grew, soil so compacted it looked like concrete, old food wrappers buried under years of leaf litter, rope swings nailed into trees that had started to rot from the inside out. None of this was done out of cruelty. But carelessness? That was harder to forgive. I started hosting monthly walks. Guided ones. No more than 10 people per group. I'd take them along the healthiest trails, point out how the understory was growing back, show them the native plants that had returned. It wasn't a lecture. It was a chance to see, really see, what happens when nature gets just enough protection to breathe again. One of the walkers was an old woman named Ruth. She'd lived in the neighborhood for over 30 years. She told me that her husband used to walk those woods every Sunday before he passed. She said he'd be happy to know the land was being protected now. That hit me in a way I didn't expect. For all the arguing, all the pushback, there were always people like Ruth, quiet, grateful, unnoticed. People who understood the value of something not because they used it loudly, but because they remembered what it meant. Even now I get emails. Some still complain. Some still believe I went too far. But more often than not, I get questions like, "Can we help with the invasive species?" Or, "Would you be open to a photography day for students?" One even said, "Thank you for doing what none of us thought to do." That one stuck with me, because it made me wonder, how often do we wait for someone else to take responsibility for the things we all quietly care about? And how different would our neighborhoods look if more people said, "You know what? I'll do it. I'll step in." Not for control, not for recognition, but because someone has to. That's what this has become now. Not a land dispute, not a grudge. Just one person doing the thing no one else was willing to do. Protect a piece of something that used to be forgotten. And invite others to care for it too, one step at a time. Months turn into a year. And with each season, the forest seemed to breathe a little easier. What was once a patch of land tangled with broken trails and litter had begun to transform into a sanctuary. Quiet, alive, and respected. The neighbors who once yelled across fences or sent angry notes slowly started to change their tune. Not all at once, but in little moments that added up, One afternoon, I was fixing a fence post near the north boundary when I heard the crunch of footsteps behind me. Turning around, I saw Mrs. Daniels, an elderly neighbor I'd barely spoken to before. She handed me a small bundle wrapped in brown paper. "I found these on my property line," she said. "Thought you might want them." Inside was a collection of old photographs, faded and worn, images of the forest decades ago. Kids playing by the creek, family picnics on the big oak, a hunting lodge that had long since disappeared. We stood there for a moment, looking at the pictures, and she said softly, "I guess you were right. This land means more than just trees and dirt." It struck me how deep people's connections to this place ran, even when they didn't realize it. The forest wasn't just my property. It was part of a shared history, a story that went beyond fences and ownership. That's when I decided to invite the neighborhood to an event. No big speeches or formal presentations, just a day to come together, explore the trails, share stories, and maybe start rebuilding what had been broken. I called it the Forest Gathering. Flyers went up on community boards, and a website post spread the word. The turnout surprised me. Families, seniors, even a few of the folks who've been the loudest critics showed up. There was laughter, tentative conversations, and a few shy apologies. Kids ran through the trees, their voices filling the space in a way the forest hadn't heard in years. I led a short walk, pointing out new growth and explaining the steps we'd taken to protect sensitive areas. I watched as people listened, really listened, not just to me, but to each other. Conversations sparked about local wildlife, gardening tips, and memories of times before the HOA's heavy hand. By the end of the day, I knew something had shifted. The forest was no longer a battleground. It was a gathering place. But even with this progress, challenges lingered. A small group remained opposed to the changes, quietly spreading rumors that I was overstepping or that the forest was becoming too exclusive. They whispered about privatizing nature and locking out tradition. It was hard to hear, especially after everything I had done to make the land accessible in a responsible way. Yet, every time doubt crept in, I reminded myself why I started this journey. Not to win popularity contests, but to protect something valuable, to create a legacy that wasn't built on conflict, but on care. And that meant listening as much as leading, inviting others to join the stewardship, encouraging volunteers to take ownership, and sharing control where it made sense. It was a balancing act, fragile but necessary. One of the volunteers, a teenager named Emma, began organizing monthly cleanups and educational hikes. She started a social media page to share photos and updates, connecting people who wanted to learn more. Watching her grow into that role was one of the unexpected joys of this whole process. She reminded me that the future of the forest wasn't just about what I did. It was about what the community did together. At night, when the forest was quiet, I'd sometimes sit on the porch and listen to the sounds, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of owls, the wind moving through the branches. It was a far cry from the tense silence that had filled those woods when I first bought the land. Now, it felt alive in a way that was peaceful, hopeful. Sometimes I think about how different it might have been if the HOA had worked with me instead of against me. If they'd treated the forest with respect from the start, maybe we wouldn't have had to go through all this. But maybe, just maybe, none of this would have happened at all. Maybe it took a little friction to spark something bigger. What started as a simple act of defiance had grown into a story about community, ownership, and change. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But it was real. And as the sun set behind the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: peace.